So thank you in every direction. Let me just begin by sharing my screen, hopefully. Well, I was hoping to share it, and it's very funny because we just did this a second ago and the document has disappeared. If you'll just give me 1 second, I'm going to go back and pull that slide presentation up again. And let me just go in and share it. It says I am screen sharing, so let me stop that and start it again. And in that way, hopefully, we will get it. Yes, there we go. Okay. So hopefully, Reg, Beth, can you confirm that you can see a black screen?
We can absolutely see a black screen.
The Dark Knight. Well, okay, let me start. And let me just start by saying, firstly, thanks anyone who's listening for listening. I wanted to say, Beth, in some setup comments just before we came online, said, no, it was nice to have somebody from the other side of the world. And I was saying, well, yes, it's an other side of the ocean. But I just wanted to say that my family has very strong links with the United States of America. The reason why this Conestoga wagon or prairie schooner or whatever we're going to call it is on the screen is that one of my great-great-grandmothers traveled 6 times across what was then called the Great American Desert or the prairies in the 1840s through to the 1860s. So I've always felt a strong sense of connection. They went first to Denver in Colorado, and then they went up to the Pacific Northwest, which is pretty much where most of them are now found. So One Health, I didn't know that much about One Health before I got involved in this session. I've learned about it further, and I'm impressed by what I've read. The title we've sort of co-conjured or conjured together is this one. And I'm going to talk about why One Health absolutely depends not simply on maintaining what we have, but on a process of regeneration. And unfortunately, almost regardless of what happens in elections in your country and other parts of the world, our problems, Beth and I were just talking about plastics, and particularly, plastics in the ocean. There are many of issues that we now face which are getting exponentially worse, whereas our solutions at best are crawling along incrementally. And we've got to marry that up and get the solutions going exponentially as well. So just a quick thought around or reflection on One Health, the idea that animals, of which we're one species, and people and the environment really need to get along and much more effectively than we currently do. That's been part of my work since the early 1970s. This is the Nile Delta, as most of you will instantly recognize. It's where I first started working on environmental impact assessments, which really were exported from the United States to the rest of the world. And that project, which lasted about 18 months, 2 years, really launched my career because I was trained as a city planner. I never really practiced that. I found things in the Nile Delta, which the United Nations, which I was then working for, refused to acknowledge, that the government of Egypt refused to acknowledge. So I was left in a rather difficult position, which was, did I simply sit on what I then knew, or did I go public? And typically, in a way, for me, I went public. I came back to London, my home city. I called up one of our magazines, New Scientist. So this was 1975 by then, and said, I got a story. They gave me the front cover and 3 or 4 pages internally. And I broke the story, and I did it because it felt the right thing to do, even though we'd signed a non-disclosure contract. And from that came pretty much everything else that I've done since. Now, I have colleagues, I have family, I have friends across the United States, but a lot of them are on the West Coast and a lot of them are in California. And one of the things I've found in recent weeks and months in calling people there is, if they happen to open their curtains, this is the sort of scene that we now see. And at least 2 of the families that we know well have been expelled from their houses. So whether it's Australia or whether it's now Amazonia, these sorts of environmental crises are really pushing in very, very powerfully now. Now, this image is just meant to make a simple point. If I had $10 for every time I've been asked the question, are you an optimist or a pessimist, I'd be extremely wealthy. I'm not going to really address that question, except to say my way of thinking about the way in which the world evolves is the biggest changes come when we've left ourselves with no real choice, when we've backed ourselves into a corner. And I think the skies on things like climate change and so on are now so dark, whether or not people choose to recognize that, that we have no choice but to jump to a very different place. So good luck with the election. We're all sort of slightly hanging on the outcome. I think it's sort of ironic in a way that the United States has just come out of the Paris Climate Agreement, having had such a huge impact on the destabilization of our climate through fossil fuel consumption. But good luck, and I do hope that somehow, sometime, you come back into that very sensible treaty. So just to give you a sense of who I am, where I sort of fit into the wider world. I'm a baby boomer. I'm 71. I've been involved in the environmental and then sustainability spaces for 45 plus years. Over that time, I've set up since 1978 4 what we now call social businesses, all for profit, but all with a very strong social and environmental mission. To my surprise, they all still exist, which is unusual for startups. A couple of them have been acquired by other people. Valence, which is the organization we set up in 2008, is where I'm currently based. Over that time, I've served on over 70, I think it's now 80 boards or advisory boards, and I've published 20 books, the latest of which is there on the right. It's called Green Swans, and I'll explain why in a moment. But the subtitle you'll see is The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. Well, most people know, and those who don't probably suspect, that capitalism does wonderful things. It's a glorious value creation system. But if you look at it from the natural world's perspective, it's a degenerative force in the world. And we now live in what scientists call the Anthropocene. We have done pretty much since I was born. I was born in 1949. The Anthropocene is meant to have started in 1950. And it's the first geological era or epoch in the Earth's history where a single species, our own, has an impact on our world, which is equivalent to geological forces. So the idea that capitalism might be regenerative will strike some people as pretty strange. But just a few weeks ago, the CEO of Walmart, you all know Walmart, committed his giant retailing company to become a regenerative business. Now, Paul Hawken, who many of you will know, has been an advisor on that, actually helped write the speech, has a very major book coming out late next year called Regeneration. But this is not such a strange agenda. And I think some of the work that you've all been doing plays into this space as well. And I'd love to know more about that. So right at the beginning of the 1990s, in fact, 1991, I got a cartoonist. I love cartoons. And this cartoonist, Ingram Pinn, still works for the Financial Times as he did then. I think he's probably their best cartoonist. And I said to him, I've got this mental image, and it's of a boardroom table and sitting around it. And so you have all of the obvious roles flagged up on the nameplates. But then in addition, you've got a fish representing the natural world. You've got a woman representing the poor around the world, the dispossessed, and so on. And you've got a robot. And the robot is there with a 3001 shoulder flash, just signifying that we need to think about the longer term as well. Now, at the time, the robot was a little bit of a joke. It's no longer a joke in the sense that the first expert system was appointed to a board in Hong Kong in 2014. And very shortly, you're going to have boards with access to artificial intelligence and expert systems. And by God, they're going to need that, because the challenges are going to become very significantly greater. So about 2 years ago, in June 2018, I had set up, in that cartoon is the sort of precursor, an agenda basically around a term that I'd coined, which was the triple bottom line, so people, planet, and profit. So that was 1994, 1995. But 2 years ago, so about 25 years in, I did a product recall on the triple bottom line. First time it had ever been done, a management concept recall. So the Harvard Business Review told me, and that's where I launched the recall. And I'll explain why. And we haven't taken it away completely, and how can we? Because the Global Reporting Initiative has thousands of companies around the world doing triple bottom line or sustainability reporting. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index is completely built around that sort of approach. The BCorporation Movement, which we may well discuss, is also, I mean, 3,500 companies, and some really quite big ones now, certified around the triple bottom line. But part of my concern, part of the reason for doing that recall, and I've worked with companies like Ford, and I've gone through recalls like the Firestone tire recall many years ago, but something like 23 million tires having to be recalled. I was feeling that the triple bottom line wasn't simply a balancing act. It wasn't saying we'll do some good on the social front, we'll do some good on the financial and economic front, and it's a shame about the environment. The idea was always that this should be integrated, that we should create value across all three dimensions. And it was also about system change. So that's created, in a way, an industry around the world, and literally tens of thousands of companies now producing these sorts of reports. Lenovo is just a case in point. Used to be IBM, part of IBM, now owned by the Chinese. But you start to see reports which I think stretch the boundaries of trust rather far. So this is one from Russia, from Siberia, and it's a coal company saying that they produce sustainable coal. Well, good luck. I mean, my view is that's not possible. It may be in the future we'll use coal for chemicals and other reasons, but burned for energy, that's not in any sense of the word sustainable. And so when I'm thinking about all this, the sort of mental model that I have in mind, the sort of map, is something like this, which is, it shows three different formats for the interactions between business and the rest of the world. And I've largely, for 45 years now, worked with business, although periodically also working with governments in one form or another. So to start with, business was pretty much doing its own thing, producing what were called externalities, social and environmental, which impacted other people or other species, but not much connection. Then we had the triple bottom line period, where increasingly people were trying to integrate this. So you had Michael Porter and Mark Kramer talking about shared value and trying to expand that central area of overlap. But I think what we should really be talking about is, in addition to shareholder value, which is not a bad thing, and shared value or stakeholder value, is system value. We've now got to the point in our evolution as a species, and this is the One Health proposition, where business has to be seen in the context, almost like Russian dolls in a way. They're nested in the heart of society, and therefore needing to do good for society, but also in the heart of the natural environment. And it's not just us saying. So I said 2 years ago, we did this product recall. And early last year, I was walking through Copenhagen Airport, and I saw this, which was a wraparound to an edition of the Financial Times, again, financial newspaper. And this wasn't just a splash. This wasn't simply a bit of typographic design. This was the beginning of a campaign for the Financial Times, which continues. And every day, when you read the paper, which I do every day, there are now something like 6 to 10 stories that in different ways link to the sustainability agenda. And the point that the FT was making was that capitalism, much as we may love it, has got to the point where it needs a fundamental reset. It's not working in the way that it was meant to, or we would like it to do. So Milton Friedman, never met him, sadly, but a brilliant man, a huge impact on the wider world, but I think his time is almost over. I think it's 50 years ago that he did his piece in the New York Times talking about the single bottom line, you know, the business of businesses, you know it. And on the 50th anniversary of that piece in the Times, a group called Imperative 21, with about 300 organizations involved, including ours, launched a full page ad, both in the New York Times and in the Financial Times. And basically the point was, you know, a single bottom line is useful up to a point, but unless you're dealing with the social and environmental and governance aspects of what a particular business is doing, it's sort of positive, yes, but also negative impacts. You're really betraying your shareholders, because at some stage that's going to run into a wall, and you're certainly betraying the wider world. I'm not going to go through each of those different sub-posters, but they give a sense of that wider agenda. So in the book, the first diagram is called the Uband. And I think we, people around the world are now looking for a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, a W-shaped recovery, maybe even a K-shaped recovery, which goes up and down at the same time. I'm not. I think we'll see some of those, but I actually think we're going through a much deeper reordering of our economies and of the global political system. So if you go back to the 1940s, you had Bretton Woods, you had Marshall Plan, you had some really, really imaginative approaches taken by the United States of America after the searing experience of the Second World War. And thank you for your role in helping turn the tide on that one. But what this yellow or ochre or whatever it is, amber line suggests is that we're coming out of a 40 to 50 year macroeconomic and technology driven cycle. And what happens when we have these moments where an old order starts to weaken and then unravel is that things after a time accelerate. And that, I think, is what we're in the process of seeing. We're seeing a very different macroeconomic and geopolitical order establishing itself. Now, it may well be that we come out of it reasonably quickly. For me, reasonably quickly would be about, on the basis of historical precedent, would be about 12 to 15 years. The problem is, every time in history where we've had one of these great reorderings, the center of gravity of the global economy shifts, and it's typically gone east. So it's typically gone west. It started off in China, went to the Middle East, Crusades took it to different parts of Europe. It went to Britain. It jumped to the east coast of the United States. It then went to the west coast, and now it's going back to Asia again. So I think we're in a very, very challenging period of our collective history. The recovery will come, but you look at that bar at the bottom, that's, I think, where we are, that people are increasingly feeling uneasy, confused, fearful, angry, and that's flashing over into our politics in different ways. So we're moving into the 2020s, you all know that, and it's going to be a difficult decade because it's going to be an exponential decade. And I think COVID-19 has already demonstrated that very clearly. And this is the Gates Foundation, a couple of months back, saying already by then, they felt within 25 weeks of the pandemic, something like 25 years of progress in the global south and developing countries had been wiped out. Well, that is a disaster, and we're several months on from that now. It hasn't got any better, and with a really effective vaccine now still on the horizon, I think the cost of the pandemic is going to climb quite considerably. And one of the things that's come out very clearly during the pandemic is how idiotic many of our governments are. Now, I believe in government. I think we need good government and effective and efficient government and all the rest of it. But in my own country, which is struggling on many fronts at the moment, you had an exercise in 2016 where scientists and health experts and so on were asked to think through what it would be like and how we might respond to a pandemic. They pretty much predicted what happened. And then what happened politically, the study was ignored. And that's exactly what we're now doing with the climate emergency. It's exactly what we're doing with the species loss emergency and various other things as well. Now, you all know that in 2015, the United Nations published its Sustainable Development goals very exciting. But the problem is that most people who are embracing the goals are seeing them as incremental goals, and they're really not. They're about system change. If you just look at the first two, no poverty and zero hunger by 2030 worldwide, well, fat chance. That's not simply not going to happen. And these are exponential goals, and people are not yet thinking of them in the appropriate way. So if you think out to the 2040s, 2050s, 2060s, these sorts of goals would still be exponential. And the problem with that is that our brains really do struggle with exponential dynamics. We don't see them coming. And once they do start to come, they come so fast, we really struggle to cope and to handle them. And I think that's one of the things that Nassim Nicholas Taleb was saying with his book, The Black Swan, published in 2007, just as the financial crash began to hove in view. And what he said about black swans was that they are completely unexpected. These are events, they're catastrophes that we don't see coming. They have an extreme impact. So COVID-19 would clearly sort of fit into that bracket. And then afterwards, we look back at what's just happened to us, try and understand what's happened, but really fail to do so. So we set ourselves up to fail all over again. Now, Taleb's been asked whether COVID-19 is a black swan, and he said absolutely not, because we saw it coming. People saw pandemics like this, coronaviruses like this. They predicted it, but we chose to ignore very largely. Now, there's a new generation of people coming up, and thank God for that. Greta Thunberg started off when she was 15, school child, was within a year or so talking to the United Nations General Assembly. She was talking to the World Economic Forum, and many of you will remember what she said, a real shock to the system. So towards a conclusion, I'll just talk a little bit about green swans. Green swans are trends that in our world. So let me just back up a moment. Nassim Nicholas Taleb talked about black swans. And these are things that largely take us exponentially, at least to begin with, where we don't want to go. And the question that I was toying with was, what would it look like if we had solutions that took us exponentially where we did want to go? Where in the world do those already exist? What might we do to give them a bit more wind in their sails or under their wings? And we've recently set up a Green Swans Observatory to track these in different parts of the world. This is a diagram done by an energy analyst who happens to be a very good science fiction author as well, Ramez Nam, looking at the way in which solar costs are likely to fall through and beyond that sustainable development goal timescale. They're not, this set of trends is not going to deliver the goals, but huge shift in the way in which energy will be generated in different parts of the world. The gray bar is the cost of current already built fossil fuel power stations. And just look at what solar energy is likely to do. This also applies to wind to some degree, also applies to battery technology. Now, quite exciting if you're on the side of the renewable energy industry, but we really have to think about this much more carefully and much earlier in the game. So, for example, if you look now at the solar arrays are starting to become obsolete, or the vanes or propellers from some of these big wind energy machines, they're not recyclable. We should have thought about that much earlier. So this has to be systemic. I think one of the things Green Swans will involve is a reframing. So, for example, I live in a city. Many of you live in towns, large towns, small cities, whatever. But one thing that happened about a year ago is my home city of London did a reframing exercise, and they declared, I was talking to Reg just before we started about national parks in the United States. London declared itself the world's first national park city. What does that do to the way you think about a city? Well, it starts to change the way you think about the level of tree planting and greenery in a city. And I think that is an indication of the sort of reframing and resetting and reinvention process that we're now going to get into. I think another absolutely crucial element in all this is policy. I said earlier on, governments obviously make me slightly nervous at times, but I think we need more government, we need more policy, we need it to be effective, we need it to be well designed. Now, my own country is backing out of the European Union, as you will mainly know. I think it's a stupid decision, but nonetheless, at the same time, the EU has launched a 1.82 trillion euro Green Deal. So in the spirit of FDR back in the 1930s. And the idea is to trigger a series of market shifts. Now we'll see whether it happens or not. We'll see whether it happens in a suitable timescale or not. But I think this is, for me, the sort of thing that I mean by a green swan. Doesn't have to be that supermassive, but that's the spirit of the thing. I think another thing, and I mentioned Greta and I mentioned the younger people coming up at every level in our businesses, our institutions, our economies, and so on. One of the companies we've been working with recently is Acciona, which is an infrastructure and renewable energy company. It's pushing for 100 years old. It's worldwide in its business. And we took 27 of their younger people from different parts of the world and worked with them to develop a collective change agenda for the company and for its partners and clients and so on. And then that was presented to the board. Really, really exciting. And I think this is something that more and more organizations will need to do. Make sure that their younger people are pulled through into decision-making earlier than they once would have been. So I'm going to end with an invitation. And just before I get there, I think a couple of key points. One is, we're all going to have to learn how to speak the language of impact. That's negative impact, clearly. That's where I started in Egypt, but it's also positive impact, how you create wealth, how you enable people to do more good stuff. Ronnie Cohen recently wrote a book called Impact. It's a wonderful manual on what that, what we're seeing in that field, and a very useful handbook. I've mentioned Acciona, but I think in company after company, organization after organization, government department after government department, we've got to mobilize the champions of tomorrow's agenda. And this is going to come quite fast, and I think it's going to come quite hard. So Rex Tillerson on the left, I hope he's not a member of any of your families, but nonetheless, even if he is, he's one of the CEOs I had a very major set to with about 12 years ago. It happened to be in Norway, in Stavanger. He was then the CEO, chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. And this is him meeting in the time when he was still doing that sort of thing with somebody you'll recognize in the pale blue suit. These people are going to have a very considerable shock. In fact, it's already starting. So ExxonMobil has lost 60% of its value just in the last year or so. The same has happened to Shell, a company I've worked with in the past. And companies like Shell and BP are now being forced, and ExxonMobil have just announced they're going to do the same, to announce very considerable sums or values of stranded assets. Things that they used to think were investable grade assets, which now they find at the moment because of COVID-19, but later on because they can see that we've probably hit peak oil already, way before they thought we would. Then these assets are becoming much less valuable than they once would have been. And you just saw this in recent weeks, where ExxonMobil, which used to be the most valuable company in the world, was overtaken by a renewables company, not by much. I mean, you'll see in the numbers, but next year Energy is pretty much a pure play renewable energy company. So pretty much the last slide, I think where we are in all of this is we're moving from an old order where responsibility, corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship, all this stuff was, the leading edge. And I played quite a role in all of that, but it's no longer enough, because if you listen to what thoughtful politicians and thoughtful CEOs are now talking about, they're talking about the problems of resilience that our world faces, because our economies, our societies, our communities, the natural environment are all in one way or another starting to wobble. Well, how do you get resilience back into all of those systems? I'm I think you can pray for it. I think you can earnestly wish for it. You can talk about it, perhaps until you're green in the face, but it doesn't materially shift the reality. The only way to build back resilience is to invest, and to invest in the longer term. And that means regeneration. Now, there will be many Black Swan events along the way. The book has things like antibiotic resistance. It has the obesity pandemic that's sweeping around the world, with chronic diseases like diabetes associated with them. Even things like, the space debris, the sheer quantity of bits of satellites and rockets and so on that's above our heads have led some people to think that, or predict that, we won't be able to get off the planet. So good luck, Elon, in getting to Mars. But unless we clean up space, you may be punctured on the way out. Last slide. And this is just an invitation, and anyone who's interested, I'd be interested to hear from. My email is john@volance.com. I mentioned the Observatory. We're starting off looking at 4 areas: cities, electricity, food, which I think may well be in range for some of you, and money. So the financial markets, investment, and so on. And the little green bird at the bottom, that's an ugly duckling. When I launched the Green Swan agenda, it was in Copenhagen, and it was in front of 1,300 CEOs and business leaders of from the Danish economy. And I was playing off, obviously, the Hans Christian Andersen story, but we're looking for ugly ducklings. We're looking for early stage ventures or technologies or business models or policies with the potential to go exponential over time. So that's me, and there's my email again. I'll just say thank you, and hopefully hand back to Reg.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was excellent. For our audience, down at the bottom of the screen is Q&A. So please, if you've got questions, put them in there. And we already have one for you, John.
Okay.
This is from Phoebe, and she asks, with sub-policies briefly, or what sub-policies briefly, did the EU Green Swan policy include?
Okay, thanks, Phoebe. They didn't use the language Green Swan. I'm just simply saying, within our framework, what the EU is doing around their Green Deal, to me, feels like a potential Green Swan, in the sense that it has potentially, it has the potential to trigger a mind shift, that people increasingly don't simply think about a green recovery. So they don't think about a recovery as business as usual. Let's just put our foot back on the accelerator. But instead, it brings in, obviously, environmental components, but it brings in social inclusion components. So the EU dispenses, as major governments do around the world, huge amounts of treasure and money. And that wealth, in a way, steers, guides, shapes the development of the European economy. To the sub-policies, they are in many, 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 many different areas, everything from building efficiency to electric forms of transportation to new types of business school education, to new, I was talking to somebody in Brussels just earlier on today about new policies to aid overseas development and secure populations in places like Africa, as the climate emergency really starts to get its claws in. And you're seeing it already. And one of the things that we know in our bones is that Africa is going to want to move to Europe over the next 20 or 30 years because of climate change. And one of the projects I'm doing at the moment is with the military in the UK. And one of the things that they're preparing for is, what happens when Africa wants to move to Europe? What do we then do? Do we try and keep them where they are and by force of arms, or do we try and help them maintain their livelihoods and so on where they are? Do we accept them into Europe? I mean, and you're going to see exactly the same thing. You're already seeing the same thing with the flows of people from Central and Southern America into the northern part of the continent. So simple answer is just there's a lot of stuff in there. I just encourage you to get a search engine out and take a look. Just look up EU Green Deal.
I can't type a question, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
This was fascinating, and I'm going to get your book. As individuals, it's always, what can we do? I
Yeah.
think we're all hoping that, corporations get the idea. I know, like Larry Fink from BlackRock sent out a letter to the CEOs to become more, mindful of the environment. What can we do besides supporting B Corps? Can you guide us to make us feel like we can do something?
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult. And many years ago, in 1988, with a colleague, Julia Hales, I wrote a book called The Green Consumer Guide. And this was an earlier iteration of the question, what can we do? And so the Green Consumer Guide sold 1 million copies in about 18 months. It had a massive impact on some of the big manufacturing companies, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and so on. And at that time, we gave ordinary citizens like ourselves advice on, if you're going to buy this sort of product, and it might be a toilet roll, it might be a detergent, it might be a car or whatever. We were talking earlier on about London and catalytic converters. So at that time, catalytic converters were a big thing. They were sort of almost a new thing. And that had quite a big impact, as I said, because people acted. The problem was the decay rate in the information was huge because the industry, business responded to the new market demand, came out with new products and pretty much outdated our books. So we kept having to update those. Some of the advice I would give to people is very simple, and it's deceptively simple. And one is just to pay attention. It is to keep an eye on what's going on in this wider world of ours and what's been done on our behalf by politicians and city mayors and all sorts of other people. And one of the really striking things I've found over the years is that most politicians get very few letters. Now, they might get more hate mail through email and so on. But when you write a thoughtful, considered note to your political representatives, it can have a quite disproportionate impact, particularly if it's not formulaic, particularly if it's not the sort of, they're not saying this is just a campaign and this has been printed out by a robot or whatever. So firstly, pay attention. Secondly, try and find the leaders who genuinely stand for the sort of agenda that you would like implemented in the world. And it used to be that we would look around for prime ministers and presidents and royal families and all the rest of it, these sort of high level leaders. And I mentioned mayors and so on. Increasingly, it's coming down to a much more granular level where people running cities or running departments of city administrations can have quite a big influence. So again, say thank you. I mean, it's weird how few of us ever say thank you to the people who are doing what we want to see done in the world. And it actually means a lot to people when they get a personal note from somebody who thinks they've done well by, hopefully a shared agenda. And the same process, it's very often the case that if you go into a retail store or a garage or whatever it is, and the exchange is always monetary and is the car ready to run and so on. Sometimes when you raise questions, that can go back through the system. Now, I actually think we are at a point where that citizen level action remains immensely important. But I think unless and until we can properly address the systemic changes that are now needed, a lot of the other stuff is going to be washed away. And I don't simply mean as it was in New Orleans or New York or whatever it is, that these changes, these systemic climate changes are now coming at us at such a rate that I work, for example, with insurance companies. I work with reinsurers, the insurers who insure the insurance companies, and they're looking at what's happening around the world. And they've been increasingly concerned for about 10 years. They're now saying if we put on a couple degrees more in terms of global warming, the world is going to become uninsurable. We will not be able to insure people's properties or businesses or whatever. So just again, pay attention, try and see what's going on in the wider world. And again, write to your local newspaper, write to, if you don't read newspapers, there'll be other media channels to do it through. But again, I would say, there used to be the term support your local sheriff or something like that. I think try and identify some of the local campaigners, activists, social entrepreneurs, and I'm sure a lot of you are doing this already. And again, support them in every which way you can. Many of them will fail. Many of them will never scale, but they're doing things to model a better future. And the final thing I would say is just talk to people. I mean, I was in Australia probably 20 years ago in a very grown-up conference, I mean, with hundreds and hundreds of business leaders in the audience. And somebody asked me in public from the audience, what was our most important strategic tool? And I think they expected me to come back like a McKinsey and say, well, it's X, Y, and Z. I didn't. I said, and I said it in the instant, I said, our most important strategic tool is our sofas, our couches. It's where people come into our offices, they sit down and we have conversations. And that's where the really interesting ideas come from, where a lot of the thinking is tested. Don't underestimate the power of conversation. Even when you've got somebody, Beth, strapped down in the dentist chair, you can tell them stuff that may just stick in their brain as long as they're not.
I do that, John. We have some other questions, so I want Reg, if it's okay, I'm going to read them to him. Tanya asked, how do we politically shift from a shareholder model of value where corporations are responsible to their shareholders to a system value model? And we have a couple more, so.
It's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. And you mentioned the BCorporation Movement. Both the recent businesses I co-founded are B corporations. We incubated B Lab, the organization behind the BCorporation Movement in London when they first arrived in the UK for 9 months. Proud of that. It's still a very small number of companies internationally. When you think of the tens of millions of companies out there, 3,500 is maybe the sharp end of a wedge, but it's only the beginning. It has to be done through policy and regulation. And, the fact that over 30 states in the United States now have allowed companies and businesses to do the triple bottom line stuff, the sustainability stuff, I think is a major step forward, because it used to be illegal. You had to focus on shareholders. And I think, I'm pleased that the Business Roundtable, so 180 some CEOs have gone public with their commitment to stakeholder capitalism, rah, rah. But in that way, if you know them deeply, you know that 40 years ago, they said precisely the same thing. And then they backed off and went in a different direction. So again, we've got to pay attention. We've got to ensure that we're not taken in or deluded
well, that strikes me with shopping, but then that's shopping with your dollars of looking what kind of company it is as well, if you can make a choice. Yep. Here's another question. Have you heard of bottle bricking? If not, it is taking plastic bottles and bags from chips and pretzels or candy and cutting up those bags and stuff as much as you can into the bottles. These are reused as building houses and building as bricks. What is your opinion of reusing those resources?
Well, I've heard of the use of plastic bottles for a range of different purposes, from doing Patagonia fleeces to building homes, or at least insulating homes. And I think in principle, it's a good idea, but do make sure before you do all of this cutting up and stuffing that you have an appropriate channel which you can trust into which these materials go, and then find a useful second or third life, because there's a huge amount of stuff that is done at the moment, which does in the recycling area, for example, where we sort and we do everything else, but we don't have the comfort of knowing absolutely that those materials go where they should be going. And again, I think it's an area where even if you can't pay attention, you don't have the time or interest or whatever, there are activist groups and others who are doing that. So again, support them in what they do. I don't think the need for NGOs is going away at all.
Yeah. Well, and I also think you have to have some virgin plastic in there for it to be strong, but you've got companies like Trex who are making like, flooring or, building materials out of their plastic, but that's out of, a different process than using plastic bottles.
Yeah.
Claire asks, similar to my question, can we help convince businesses to be more sustainable by carefully shopping for sustainable products, produced products? Does it really make a difference in the environment and business decisions if we buy the more expensive bamboo toilet paper? It seems an impossible task to constantly do the research as a consumer. Here, Claire. Go ahead. What's your response?
No, Claire, I think thank you everyone who tries to send market signals by making what they feel are the right choices. I think it's become more complicated because nowadays you've got Black Lives Matter, you've got Me Too, you've got so many different movements, and that's great because people are finding their voices, they're expressing their values and their priorities. But trying to sift through, is it green, is it ethical, is it whatever, has become significantly more important. I think the consumer voice remains important. I don't think that will become less the case. In fact, when we had, the green consumer wave, that really shocked businesses rigid because they weren't used to consumers paying any attention to these sorts of issues, and suddenly they had to explain themselves and reformulate and so on. So don't give up, but do prioritize and do try and pick some of the issues that you think you're almost like a swing state. Where would your consumer vote have a particularly high impact? And then
Claire asks a good question about paper from wood versus paper from bamboo. Does that make a difference?
From me, probably not. And I'm not saying that against the companies who are producing bamboo paper. There's no question that it's an astonishingly fast-growing plant, and therefore probably on balance a very good thing. But every time we looked at the life cycle of major products, and they might have been diapers, they might have been paper products versus cloth products, whatever it was, you'd end up with a balance that was more or less the same, but against rather different issues. So make a noise, push where you can, do research if you've got the time, because you may actually find that you're supporting a product which has some other issues associated with it. But I am very lucky. My wife and I have been together for 52 years, and she does all of that sort of stuff. I just talk about it.
Gotcha. Chrissy asks, with all these negative things going on around the globe, how do we maintain hope and positivity?
Well, I'm the last person to ask. I was born an optimist. I've always felt that regardless of the state of the world, things can get better. And if we get involved, they could well get better. I would just say that, and I think I started more or less by saying this, I think as a species, we tend to do our best work when we've backed ourselves into a corner, or we've been backed into a corner. And now here we are, we're in the mother of all corners. I'm not just talking politically, but I'm talking about climate, I'm talking about what's happening in our agricultural soils, the need to regenerate soils. I mean, I fought a multi-month legal battle once with McDonald's back in the late 1980s because of our book, The Green Consumer Guide. We won, but I'm thrilled that McDonald's is now looking into moving from feedlot agriculture into cattle management patterns that are based on buffalo and some of the original grazers of the prairies. And I love biomimicry, and I'm sure many of you are involved in that. And I just think support some of the people who are doing the really extraordinary innovation work in this space. And Janine Benyus at Biomimicry 3.8 I think is one of those people like Darwin, who in 100 years will look back at and think, God, she was fantastic, and people must have loved her then. Well, the answer is Darwin wasn't actually paid much attention to until about 30 years after he was dead. For God's sake, let's not leave it with Janine and people like her until they're long since.
Would you repeat that name again so that we can look her
So,
up?
so Janine Benyus, Benyus, and the organization is called Biomimicry 3.8. And it's 3.8 because basically she's saying that evolution has worked on solutions to many of our most challenging problems or needs over 3.8 billion years. So why don't we tap into some of that wisdom, because it's tried and tested. I mean, I could talk about lots of other people, but when people ask me that question, I think there's so many people out there now doing great stuff who people don't know about properly. And so one of the things that what she's done is to work with Interface. We were talking about plastics. Interface, of the carpet company, have just produced the world's first carbon positive. It's actually, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. Carpet. And Janine has been, and Paul Hawken have both been very important in making that process happen. So,
Okay, I have another question. I'm hoping you can understand it better than I'm not understanding. What about the
okay.
notion that individual items, commodity, become more expensive, but we purchase fewer of them? Does this help? Is this compatible with growth capitalism?
Well, simple answer is yes. Initially, any new product that has an improved performance is going to be expensive, and it's going to be more expensive because the economies of scale haven't yet tripped in. It's still almost artisanal level.
Like when
craft.
LEDs first came in.
Yeah, and they were immensely expensive, and now they're the default setting. They're cheaper and they last longer and they're more energy efficient. So many of these things are on a evolutionary curve of their own. And I think one of the things that is again worth thinking about is if you're going to use any of your money, any of your consumer purchasing power to drive something, what's that going to be? Where do you see the potential for exponential change over a period of time? And I've become a believer in economies of scale, just having seen time and time again, new technology, new innovations, new products coming through, and in the end, going cheaper than the products that they were originally sort of positioned against.
Well, that's exciting. And here's the last question from Melissa. She said, how do educators reframe fundamental courses such as microeconomics to integrate regenerative concepts and green swans?
Well, thanks for that, Alyssa. I mean, I should say before I answer, I went to university in the late 1960s to study economics, and I gave it up after 1 year because it seemed to have very little to do with what was going on in the wider world. And microeconomics in particular, macroeconomics and economic history, I found a lot more to offer. I think, well, two things. One is the most exciting trend in the world for me at the moment, or at least one of them, is that economists are now waking up or coming in with this sort of mindset. So if you think about Mariana Mazzucato, if you think about Kate Raworth with Donut Economics, you've got a rising generation of economists, and notably a number of them are now women. And I don't think that's insignificant. I think that's actually an important part of their story. I think green swans can be brought into macroeconomics, certainly. Microeconomics, the best way would be to try and find some examples of businesses or initiatives that are playing into a green swan market trajectory, and then try and do the macroeconomic analysis on that. If you do that, as I said, we've set up the Observatory, and one of the things that we're trying to do is to find people doing interesting, relevant work, and then we intend to spotlight that work and network some of the people who are playing into this space. But good luck with that, because I think it's an important area.
There's Reg.
Well, we are out of time, but thank you so much for an incredible presentation. It's been a great discussion. And I hope that everybody will run out and get your book. I'm certainly going to recommend that our library have that so that everybody has a chance to take a look at it. And I want to thank Heritage Conservancy for co-sponsoring today. Thank you so much, Beth. And I hope that we'll see everybody at our next One Health seminar this evening at 6 p.m. with Peter Couchman, also co-sponsored by the Heritage Conservancy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reg. Thanks, Beth. Thanks, everybody. And good luck over the next few days.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, John. Well, I think we're going to have to all be waiting for a few days before
Yeah.
we see any resolutions.
Yeah, we're all waiting together.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.